Hello and welcome to the Walled Garden podcast. And a very happy new year to all of you wonderful listeners from around the globe. Thank you so much for your support in 2021. It was an incredible year for the podcast. I know it was a very challenging year around the world, of course, but we can break these things down and say, well, we did well here and perhaps out here we struggled. But nonetheless, we're all very much looking forward to bringing you an amazing show this year. I will let you know that on Wednesday, Sharon, Kai, and myself will be getting together and having a conversation, which we will hopefully release on Wednesday, where we'll be outlining our ultimate vision for 2022 in terms of everything that we'll be doing on the Walled Garden, including the show as well as the community. And so we are very, very much looking forward to a very exciting year ahead. But nonetheless, I want to give you a couple of updates before Wednesday and before I dive into introducing our guest for today. Because if you have really enjoyed the Soul Searching with Seneca episodes that I've done, whether it is through Patreon, where there are over 100 episodes there, or on the Walled Garden, you can get them there as well. Or if you've just heard the 10 to 15, I believe, that I've released on the Practical Stoic, now the Walled Garden. It's all very confusing, but I promise we'll get through this. So if you've really enjoyed that Soul Searching with Seneca series, then I am actually starting to now release it as a separate podcast altogether under the channel of the Walled Garden. So you can search in pretty much anywhere where you can get great podcasts. Just search Soul Searching with Seneca, and you will find the podcast there. There should be 3 episodes released by now, and there will be, I believe, 2 episodes being released per week. Perhaps 3 for the first month. Well, you'll see anyway. So just duck over there, find that podcast, give it a review if you've enjoyed it. That'd be really helpful. And I hope that you enjoy that series. I'm absolutely loving putting it together. And the other exciting piece of news is that I will be continuing weekly Soul Searching with Seneca meetups this year as a part of the Walled Garden community, as well as for my Patreon supporters who are still over there. And so if you would like to attend those, you can take a look at when they are at by going to thewalledgarden.com/events, right? And the very first one is coming up this Sunday for me at 6 a.m. I know, a great time for me to be doing a meetup, but for most of you, that'll probably be in America Saturday afternoon or in Europe Saturday evening. And so I'd love to see you there. And this week we are focusing on Seneca's letter number 31 on siren songs, which is such a powerful letter, just jam-packed full of deep, deep wisdom. So come along to that, and it'll be great to discuss this letter with everybody. Philosophy is always a lot easier to practice in a community, and that's what we are really excited about with the Walled Garden this year. So nonetheless, I do want to now introduce you to the first guest of the year, none other than Paul O'Brien. Now, Paul was actually recommended to me by Kai Whiting. Kai said to me, look, you've got to talk to Paul. He's got such an interesting backstory. You know, he'll be also a fascinating person to talk to because of your background in poetry and this sort of stuff. And so I thought, great, let's have the conversation. And it turned out to be really, really interesting. Of course, because it's a recommendation from Kai. So I'll let you know a little bit about Paul. So Paul O'Brien is an entrepreneurial strategist, philosopher, and raconteur who invented divination software and created the world's largest astrology and divination e-commerce business, Tarot.com. He is a sought-after advisor, interview subject, and speaker, as well as author of The Visionary Ching, a book of changes for the 21st century, Intuitive Intelligence, and the Visionary Ching app for smartphones. He's the executive director of the Divination Foundation, and for 30 years, Paul has hosted Pathways Radio in Portland, Oregon, an interview program focused on personal and cultural transformation. So that's a little bit about Paul O'Brien, and I want to say a couple of things as well, because I know that a lot of you out there, who are interested in Stoicism, may be of the intellectual, the academic type, who, when they hear something like divination or tarot cards and stuff like that, you might be thinking, okay, what's this going to be all about, right? But what I found really interesting about this discussion is that we go into some of the reasons why you might consider books like the Ching, the classic Chinese sacred work, right? Why you might consider that to be a book of divination, what it is about the ancient way that tarot cards were used that made them a tool of divination, rather than the perhaps more modernized kind of new agey version of tarot cards that we have today. And so I was really new to a lot of this stuff, and so I just came into this conversation with a really open mind, wanting to learn something from Paul, and I certainly did. It was a very fascinating conversation about these sorts of things. And so I know that you, like I did, will come into this conversation with an open mind and seek to gain something, a different perspective about these ancient texts that perhaps you didn't have before. And I know that you'll learn something. It's quite fascinating. So anyway, nonetheless, I really want to introduce you now to my special guest, Paul O'Brien. Enjoy. So, Paula, thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with me today. I'm really grateful that you've taken some time out to come on the show. And I guess let me first ask you just to maybe tell a little bit of your story, how you came to be where you are. Running a radio show and author of multiple books, and what has been your life story to now, I guess, is if you can tell that in 5 minutes.
Well, I don't know if I could tell in 5 minutes. I'm pretty old, Simon, but I'll do my best to keep it within reason. Um, I've always been somebody who was attracted to meaning. I've always been curious. I'm very curious astrologically. I've got a lot of planets in Gemini. I'm a very curious fellow, and I have often said that the very first word I ever uttered was why. And so I've been trying to figure shit out since I was, 2 years old. And it's just kind of my nature. So I've always been very interested in the spiritual and in the meaning of life. And ever since I was a young child. And I grew up in a family that was very religious, Catholic family. And they sent me off to Catholic school. And that didn't help. That kind of that kind of got me off track. But the point is, I was always interested in the meaning of things. And so when I became a teenager, I grew up in the San Francisco area during the 60s. And so I was right there for the counterculture, the whole hippie movement, and the psychedelic movement. And so I left home when I was 18 and I joined the counterculture. And I smoked a lot of pot and I took a lot of LSD, which opened my mind enormously to other dimensions of consciousness. And so that was kind of a boost. And when I was 19, I was a student at the University of California in Berkeley. I was introduced to this ancient Taoist classic called the I Ching or Yi Jing. And I know you're aware of it, but maybe some of the people in the audience aren't. It's about 3,000 years old, and it's kind of, you might say, it's a divination system, and I can define that for you in a second. But it's sort of like the tarot cards of China, but there's no cards involved, and it's much older than that. And it's one of the source books of Taoist wisdom that basically informs things like the martial arts, Chinese medicine. It's the whole yin yang approach to reality. The fabric of reality is the interplay between yin and the yang, the light and the dark, all of these polarities that are mixing all the time. And you see that symbol of the Tao, which is a circle with the inverted paisleys, which means, and one of them is the yin and one of them is the yang, and they're like flowing into each other all the time. Tai Chi is an expression of the same thing. So it's one of the five Taoist classics, but it's more than just a book. And originally there was no book, but Confucius had a lot to do with that. It's a divination system. Now, what does that mean? That means it's a way to stimulate your intuition, to think outside the box around problems that logic can't handle. Now, that's the definition I came up with. It. I wrote a couple of books about it in the last 10 years. And so, how does it do that? Well, in the case of the I Ching, you cast 3 coins 6 times, and there's four different ways they can land. You can get 3 heads or 3 tails, or 2 heads and a tail, or 2 tails and a head, and there's different odds associated with what's the likelihood of any one of those 4 lines. And then you get 4 lines that are either yin or yang, or changing yin or changing yang. And changing just means you got 3 of a kind, so that's less likely to happen. And then you can look that up in this ancient book, and there's many, many versions of it on the market. And you look it up, and it gives you a reading, which is the interpretation of that energetic pattern of yin and yang. And if you have changing lines involved, it's telling you what's likely to be changing, how things are evolving. So it's a way of managing change. It's a change management system, probably the original one. And it's a way of getting insight and thinking outside the box around problems that logic can't handle. Now, this is not to decry logic. I have a chapter in my book, Intuitive Intelligence, about logic that shares a technique for accessing, for doing logical decision making. And logic is a great tool. It's the basis of the scientific method. It's a fantastic thing. If a problem lends itself to a logical solution, logic is the way to go. And logical thinking skills are very important for so much of life. But there's categories of decisions that are very important that logic really can't handle. And these are things that, like relationships or timing issues or negotiation strategies or different approaches that we might take in a sticky situation. There's a lot of problems that logic can't really deal with. And timing is like generic to all of them. The timing factor is present in all these kinds of situations. So that's what casting the I Ching is going to do. It's going to stimulate your intuition. It's not going to give you answers per se. It's not going to tell you exactly what to do. It's just going to remind you that there's more than 2 solutions to every problem. And it's not, in other words, to go beyond black and white thinking and maybe jog your consciousness to consider something that your ego would have never thought of. So it's a tool. So I got turned on to this by this girl when I was 19 years old. This really lovely co-ed was showing me this system and this book and these coins. And I thought, okay, she's cute. I would like to get to know her better. I'll play along with this. And so she's saying, okay, you write down something that's on your mind. And I wrote down something that really didn't mean anything to me. I was just fooling around. I was a 19-year-old smart aleck, and I thought that was the way to impress girls. And so I just basically was making fun of the whole thing and didn't have a serious query. And so I cast the coins, and she looked it up for me. And lo and behold, I got, for my very first I Ching reading, I got hexagram number 4, which is entitled Youthful Folly. And it describes the student lacks respect for the teacher. And I had enough perspicacity to realize that I was the student and the I Ching was the teacher, And I was making fun of it. And what did it do? It reflected my energy and it's making fun of me. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's pretty bizarre. Let me try that again. So this time, I still didn't have a serious question. The first time, I just completely ignored my question. It just basically reflected my energy. So I tried it again, but this time I was a little more serious in the sense that I was testing it. I said, okay, well, let's see what it does this time. And so I was testing it. I wasn't making fun of it. And it came back with a response that said something to the effect, questioning the sincerity of the seeker. It's testing me. So that was all it took for me to get really interested in this thing. I saw it as an energetic mirror, and I became a student of the I Ching and studied it ever since. Then there was one other thing that fascinated me in college, and that was software. Well, this is the early 70s, and nobody knew what software was, but I had a friend who worked in a computer center. In those days, there was a mini computer. It cost like $150,000. It would take up this whole room, require lots of air conditioning, and have humongous mag tapes, and maybe one tiny little terminal, which was the size of an oscilloscope, and it had less power than my iPhone has today. But my friend was a programmer there, and he was writing programs for the internet. It was called ARPANET. This was like the very beginning of the internet. And he was writing programs that would help you send large streams of data over the internet by compressing them and then decompressing them and this kind of thing. It's called data communications. And so I didn't care about that, but we would go there late at night. He'd have the keys to the place, and he had a program that he had downloaded from MIT, which was a game that ran on this PDP-11, PDP-1145 computer. It was called Space War. And he rigged up a couple of joysticks to this little oscilloscope monitor. And we would play this game and have these tiny little spaceships that were about 5 pixels long, and they would shoot photon torpedoes. It was great fun. And we would smoke a lot of pot, and we would commandeer this scientific research machine to play this game late into the night. And that was so fascinating to me. My Gemini mind, I've never really been a gamer, but I was just completely fascinated by the idea that some programmers had written some code that delivered an immersive experience, an immersive interactive experience through this computer. And I thought, wow, this software stuff is amazing. It's like a form of magic. And I wanted to learn more about it. I wanted to get into the software business by hook or by crook. I was looking for a job. And so I started bugging the director of computing there for a job, any job. I'd do anything. And, I had recently dropped out of college. I was basically selling marijuana. I was a marijuana salesman. And this was before it was legal.
I like your phrasing there, marijuana salesman, not a dealer. You're a salesman, a sales professional.
That's right. And I got in trouble. The state of Oregon did not approve of what I was doing, and I went to jail tripping on acid. Actually, I was such a wild young hippie. I went to jail twice tripping on acid. Now that's what you
the best kind of people.
That's what you call a bad trip, really. So I'm in jail, and I got sentenced to 45 days, or I didn't get sentenced yet. My friend Jack at the computer center, and this is a story that has a moral, and I don't know if it has a stoic moral or what. So anyway, my friend Jack goes to Dan, the director of computing, who I had been bugging to get a job, and he goes, Dan, O'Brien, he really needs a job. He needs us to step up for him. And he goes, what happened? And he tells him I'm in jail and I'm going to be going to court. And so Dan gave me a job in order to help me stay out of prison, because that was a serious crime. The affidavit read, illegal stimulation of the central nervous system against the peace and dignity of the state of Oregon. Wow. I'm thinking, my defense was, what the hell does the state of Oregon know about stimulating the central nervous system? What would you have me do? Eat a Big Mac and a six pack and drink a six pack? I mean, what? No, but I couldn't make that argument. I had anyway. Dan went to. I got bailed out, and Dan gave me a job because I could type. I was a fast typist, and Jack needed all this documentation typed up. That's how I got into the computer industry. So the kind of the moral of the story is sometimes what seems like a living nightmare can turn into the greatest blessing. If I hadn't gotten busted, and when I was in jail, I read a science fiction book about computers, Giles Goat Boy. Wow, what a great book. So I was just so turned out. And then I got that job as a secretary. Well, as Dan's secretary, one of the things that Dan did as the director of computing was he would sell software that Jack made in order to support this nonprofit research institute in Eugene, Oregon. It was kind of attached to the University of Oregon. And I started, as his secretary. I mean, I'm going to work. I have long hair. I'm not wearing any shoes. I'm wearing short pants. I mean, these were wild times. These were very wild times. And but I was answering the phone for Dan, and a lot of times Dan was out running around somewhere, and I'd take the call. And pretty soon I started to understand what was going on. And these people wanted to buy the software, and they needed to have some questions answered. And so I started taking care of all of that. And so I started basically selling the software. Well, I was making $660 a month. That was my salary. But it's okay. I was learning. I was happy. I was excited. I was adding value for Dan. And he started taking me to trade shows and teaching me the ropes of the nascent software industry. So that's how I got into the software industry. And I elevated myself. I moved to Portland, and I promoted myself as a software marketing specialist. And I got a job at another nonprofit doing that. I like to say I've never been qualified for any job that I ever got.
But you're good at the branding. You're good at putting that the right title on it.
Well, it was more than that. I was good at treading water and learning really fast. Fast enough so that they didn't fire me before they figured out I didn't know anything. So that was very helpful. And so I became a software marketing specialist. And but then I went off on a pilgrimage to India. And I lived in India and worked for a yoga teacher for a year. And then I went around the world with a Buddhist meditation teacher who has an ashram. Well, she's deceased now, but she had an ashram outside of Sydney, Australia. And I met her in Sri Lanka, and she took me as her assistant. So I wrote a book for her. I wrote a book for the yoga teacher. I ghost wrote a book for the yoga teacher in India. And I've always had writing skills. And so that's how I became a Buddhist meditation teacher. And then I came back to Portland, and I was out of money, and I needed to go back into the software business. And so I became an executive in the software, a marketing executive. And about 1987, I was working for a brutal company. The office politics were horrible. And I found myself taking the I Ching to work. And just because I just had to get through the day, And so the I Ching, it's like the martial arts. You can there's three ways to approach any potential conflict. You can assert yourself, type A approach, or you can retreat. Sometimes it behooves you to run like hell, or you can just do nothing and let the waves of change wash over things and let things pass. So the I Ching was helping me do that because it was very difficult to get an executive software position in the late 80s. There wasn't hardly any of them around. And so I didn't really want to lose the job. I was making a lot of money, but it was brutal and I didn't like it. So I actually took the I Ching to work. Well, I didn't want anybody to see this because everybody was an engineer except for me. I'm a very right-brained person. And so I would go in a little room and I'd lock the door and I'd cast a reading or something just to help myself calm down. And one day a light bulb went off and I thought, gosh, I wish I could just do this on the computer. I wonder if there's a way. And we were a Macintosh shop. This is the early Macintosh days. And And I thought, oh, well, this is a multimedia computer. Maybe I could do and I was fascinated by the idea of multimedia ever since I played that game, Space War, in the early 70s. So I had this idea go off that was the intersection of two things that had fascinated me in my youth. And I write about this in the book Intuitive Intelligence, how stage one of life, I call it stage one, is the student stage. And that's when you learn who you are, what you're good at, and what you love to do. And part of the way you do that is you chase down fascinations. What fascinates you? Well, two things that fascinated me: the I Ching, which I kept up with my whole adult life. I never made a decision without getting input from the I Ching, not a strategic decision. And number two was software and the whole promise of multimedia. Well, in 1987, there were no CD-ROMs. The CD-ROMs came around 93 or 94. But I figured out, I thought, well, I got to try this. So I took my entire life savings, which at that time was about $50,000, and I invested in a programmer and an artist outside the company, and I created one of the very first multimedia titles, which was an interactive I Ching experience. Well, this demanded that I write a version of the I Ching because I didn't have the rights to any of them. And I thought they were all kind of arcane and patriarchal anyway. So I thought I could improve upon it without, violating the essence of it or the spirit of it. So that I just put everything into that. I was just so in love with that project because it meant everything to me. I found so much meaning in this experiment. I didn't know if it was going to work. I had to figure out a way for the mouse and the keyboard to substitute for casting coins. And I wanted that to not just be mathematically exact, but I wanted it to be energetically authentic. I wanted there to be something that you're doing that makes a difference, not just some random number generator. And I figured out a way to do that. And so I created, unwittingly, one of the very first multimedia titles, and also the first divination software. And I published it. I put it in a box. I hired somebody to design it, and I actually was able to get it into the shelves of Egghead Software, which was the big retailer at the time. They had 200 stores, and I got it in there. And so that's how I became an entrepreneur. Well, I never imagined that it was going to lead to anything very lucrative. My mission was very simple. My vision was to be able to make a living doing something that was meaningful to me. I left a high-paying job. I left money for meaning, and that's all I hoped for. I just wanted to be able to pay the rent. I wasn't expecting I Ching software to ever be highly lucrative, and it never was. But I did manage to sell like 10,000 copies, which got me through a few years, and then started making more mainstream stuff. But then when CD-ROMs came out, I went back and I did an I Ching CD-ROM, and then I did a do-it-yourself tarot card reading CD-ROM. And so I had a little CD-ROM business. So when the internet started, when the World Wide Web started up, I had a CD-ROM business, and I used the World Wide Web to market, e-commerce. And so I'm selling CD-ROM. Well, this was not a very good business, but CD-ROMs are not really a great product to sell because you got to support them for life. It's a one-time $39 or $49 kind of thing. But it was something, and I was making, the company was making a couple $100,000 a year. And then the internet, the World Wide Web, well, we started to get, they started banging on the multimedia sampler that we had. Well, this was in the times of the beginning of AOL. What was the baud rate then? I mean, it was just ridiculous how slow everything was. But so we created this interactive demo, and people just loved it. People were just banging on it like crazy. And I thought, oh, geez, we're in the internet business, whether we like it or not. This is what people want. So then I managed to get a loan from a bank to make a website in order to sell one reading at a time for $5 or $10. And that was a miracle. It's so amazing. When you're doing what you're meant to do, things come to you. This banker went to bat for me. This little guy from South Africa, he wore polyester sport coat, drove a Ford Pinto, and he just went to bank. He filled out all the paperwork and everything for a small business loan, which I didn't think I had an ice cube's chance in hell to get any loan from anybody. I had no investors. It was just such a crazy business idea, but somehow he pulled it off, and he got me that loan, and we built the website. And then I affiliated with AOL. I told them they had a horoscope section, and they thought adding the I Ching and the Tarot to it would be kind of fun for their users. So they affiliated with me, and I started to get quite a bit of traffic as a trickle down from AOL. And then I added astrology, and I beat out astrology.com to get the horoscope franchise with AOL. And then I beat out another one to get the horoscope franchise with Yahoo. Meanwhile, I'm operating out of my basement. I mean, it's unbelievable. These guys don't have any idea how small I am. But, and that drove massive traffic. And to make a long story short, we started to be pursued for acquisition because I got it up to, I was poaching members from AOL. Now, it wasn't cheap. This is just another thing. So in order to provide AOL with a daily horoscope, just a free daily horoscope, you have to guarantee them $500,000 a year. Now, this was back in the year 2000, but you have to guarantee them $500,000 a year or 50% of your revenues that come from their trickle down, whichever is greater. Well, geez, I was making $300,000 a year, all told. Yeah. So they let me pay it quarterly, and luckily for me, we pulled it off and made $600K that first year that we got all that traffic because I had a lot of reports to sell. I had a lot of products. So I was an e-commerce pioneer selling information products. There was no cost of goods. People would just do-it-yourself tarot card readings or do-it-yourself astrology reports. And so anyway, I kept building the business year after year. It just kept getting better and growing until we had 10 million registered members of our own. And we got it up to 10 million. Well, we got it up to 5 million in sales, in revenues. And that's when we doubled that and it got that to 10 million. And that's when I sold it. I wasn't going to sell it at all. I never had an exit strategy because I never thought it would ever, I wasn't in it for the money. I left money. I left money for meaning, and then the money came anyway. And I sold it for tens of millions of dollars and started a nonprofit, which is where I'm at right now. So that's the story in a nutshell of how I got to be where I am now. And then I wrote a couple books and I've done a lot of traveling. And I took my radio show. I've had the radio show for 35 years. And it's a podcast now. So I syndicated the radio show as a podcast. It's one of the things my nonprofit does. And it's 35 years now. Wow, man, I'm so friggin' old. But I'm going to do that for the rest of my life because, maybe I should have you on the show because I enjoy doing that. But in any case, that was more than 5 minutes. So sorry about that.
No. You've given us a lot to think about here. I mean, it's certainly an interesting life story, right? And you're right. There's just this. Sometimes you get this feeling that you're just being pulled in a certain direction, and if you choose to follow the meaning, then I always think that if you choose to follow the meaning that you're being pulled towards, and if you really put your heart and soul into it, and if you really decide that you're going to aim at the best possible thing you could aim at, the best possible outcome will happen. And that doesn't mean that you'll get everything that you want, but it'll be, if you're paying attention, it'll be the best thing for you, and you'll learn what you need to learn, right? And I'm really glad that you brought up the I Ching, because I have to tell you, it's right here. This massive book behind me, and I haven't actually read it yet because it's just been sitting on my shelf. I bought, I think, because I'm intimidated because I don't know quite how to approach it. But having you tell me now, and I will tell you that I have these 3 Ryan Holiday coins next to me here, so I'm going to have to use them. But I wonder if this is almost I'd like your opinion on this. If this is almost a characteristic of sacred texts in general, in that they allow us to have an intuitive experience, almost an initiation into that kind of world of, you might say, metaphor and divination, you might say. Do you think that this is, in general, a characteristic of many sacred texts, or is this something that you think would be unique to the I Ching?
Well, it's not unique to the I Ching, but it's unique to a divination system. And that's the difference. The I Ching that you have back there, that's the Wilhelm Baines version, the Princeton Press version. That is the best-selling version. It's a little arcane. There's a lot of things in there that don't make sense to the modern reader, but it's not a book that you read from cover to cover. You know, it's got 64 chapters, and each chapter is an archetype. And so in like tarot cards, there's 78 cards, 78 archetypes. So a divination system consists of a set of archetypes. So, you know, there's archetypes that are presented in all kinds of books. But this is actually a discrete collection of archetypes that's balanced. They're not all warm and fuzzy like, you know, angel cards or many things that you could find in a New Age bookstore. Nowadays, people are inventing what they're calling divination systems, but their set of archetypes is all warm and fuzzy, and it lacks any shadow elements. The I Ching's got some tough stuff in there, and so do tarot cards. You know, you've got the Hanged Man, you've got Death card. You know, you've got some difficult situations that the archetype represents. So what makes something a divination system is really two things. It's got a set of archetypes, hopefully one that's balanced, and that's why I prefer the classical divination systems rather than these made-up modern ones. And it operates on the synchronicity principle. So you could think of a book like the Bible or something as a divination system if you thought, well, you know, I'm just going to open it to a page, and that's where I'm going to get the message that I need to get right now. That's called stichomancy. Well, okay, but you're generally going to open it towards the middle of the book. It's not really random enough. It's not really randomized enough to be a good divination system, in my view. But there's nothing wrong with doing that. There's nothing wrong with finding the signs and omens wherever you can. You know, so that's what these. So the thing that happens with the synchronicity principle means that everything happens for a reason, or there are no accidents, and the coincidences have meaning. And so a synchronicity was defined by Carl Jung as a meaningful coincidence. And so you create a coincidence, which is the way that 6 coins land. You write the pattern down. Or you create a coincidence, which is these are the cards that I drew from the tarot deck when I was thinking of XYZ. So this coincidence is you're focused on a problem or an issue or a dilemma, and you do a process. It's a ritual, and that ritual is sort of like it's kind of what you're doing is you're creating a coincidence. You're creating you're giving rise to a synchronicity that you can then interpret with the help of that book that you've got, or with the help of some book that comes along with tarot cards. So like when I did tarot.com, which is another great story. How did I get that domain name? I got that domain name because a guy came to me and said, I like the way you're doing this. Would you like to buy tarot.com? Okay. He was one of the original synchronicity buyers. And he said, I've been watching you and I've been following you, and I have tarot.com and I have iching.com. I wonder if you'd like to acquire them. I go, are you kidding? Of course I would. How much is it? And then he gave me this outlandishly high number. Well, it really wasn't. In retrospect, in hindsight, it was a low number, but it was too high. My advisor said, "Oh no, you can't afford that." And then I talked to the guy and I said, "Well, would you let me pay it off in 12 easy monthly payments?" He said, "Oh, well, okay." And then I ended up paying him off at 5. So that's how I got tarot.com, was because I was doing what I was supposed to be doing, and the universe was offering me resources like that. But anyway, on tarot.com, what we did was I worked with a tarot expert, a tarot scholar, and we put together what would be a book like that. It would be a 1,500-page encyclopedia that included the meaning of any card in any position, any of the 78 cards, in any position in any of 20 spreads. And so then when you went on to tarot.com, you you could hold the mouse on the deck and it would shuffle the cards and get them all randomly shuffled. And then we would spread the cards out on the screen, and you'd use the mouse and you'd actually pick your own cards. So it was energetically authentic. You actually were picking the cards. And people just love that. All the other tarot sites, you'd go there and you click a button. I mean, we were the first one, but the other ones that came around, you click a button and the programmers would spit out 5 cards. Wow, you didn't pick those cards. So I was very, very religious about that factor. The same thing with the I Ching. We had a way of casting the coins, whereas all the other I Ching sites that came later, you hit a button and it gives you a hexagram. Okay, well, all right, maybe there's some meaning in that, maybe not. But I thought it was more meaningful if it was energetically authentic. So that's the difference. A divination system, there's not that many of them. And there's not that many of them that are worthy of the name. I mean, you've got tarot, you've got the I Ching, you've got runes. And then, there are ways to use astrology like that, although most people don't. And numerology too. But and those were the only 5 that I ever had on my site because I wanted it to be authentic divination site. I didn't want it to be a BS thing that, just, I wasn't just trying to make money.
And I think when you're talking about this, a lot of my listeners, I find myself being less cynical of, I guess, these ancient systems that have evolved through these cultures, something like the I Ching, where, clearly many people have had experiences, with this document, where they feel as though they're better able to, connect with the intuitive side of humanity. I think that's something that really, awakened me to just the importance of our intuition. Is I kind of came to a point last year where I started thinking, okay, well, every single other thing that we see in the universe, whether it's trees, creatures, anything that's alive, you might say, but everything's alive. That's a silly way to put it. But, they'll have this kind of natural inbuilt compass. Like I started thinking, okay, lion doesn't get up in the morning and think, well, what should I do today? No, it's being guided by its natural instincts. And seeing as humans are a part of the natural landscape, and seeing as we evolved out of that world, or we're still very much in it, but there has to be a part of us as well that still has that ancient memory of, call it intuition, whereby we can tap into that source and be able to gain deeper insights into situations in our life, insights that, like you say, perhaps a logical approach isn't going to really cut it, but if you go by intuition, it's going to give you a more profound guide, I guess. And I think as I've explored that idea, it's really opened my mind to these ancient systems of, like you say, divination. But I wonder if we could. I want to ask you 2 things here. Firstly, I want to ask you if you could give some sort of breakdown of exactly what your understanding of divination is. I know we've been talking about it in terms of these systems, but a lot of people never really talk about these terms, and so it's something that we don't really understand. And as well, I guess I would wonder how that relates to awakening the intuition part of ourselves.
Well, intuition is not a muscle that we can assertively flex. It's basically there for us. It's like they call it the 6th sense. And you basically have to create an opening for it in order for it to be operative. I like to compare it, I look at the hand, and so you got the 5 fingers, those are the 5 senses. And I think of each of the fingers as an antenna. And so you've got, sight and sound and touch, etc. And these are huge antennas that have a high bandwidth, particularly the visual cortex, which takes up half the brain. So these things are, very wide channels of data, if you will, that, basically keep us keep our brains churning all day long. And I like to think of the intuition as like there's a tiny little sixth one over here, and it's a really tiny, you know, small antenna that's calibrated to a very fine signal that is easily overwhelmed by the noise of all the other ones. And so basically, it's pretty difficult to have an intuitive insight when you need it the most because there's so much noise in the system. And there's noise inside of the mind too. If you think of the palm of the hand as the mind itself, there's all kinds of churning going on in there. And then you throw in emotions, and that's when you tend to need intuition the most, is when you're upset or when you're dealing with some stressful situation. Then it's even more churning than ever. There's so much noise in the system, it's very difficult to access the intuition. You kind of think of it as those old ham radios, and you want to bring in Bora Bora, and it's this very faint signal, and you have to and there's all this noise on the line and all this static and all these much stronger signals that you have to somehow dial it in very fine in order to get tuned into it. And the intuition is kind of like that. So meditation helps. In my book, Intuitive Intelligence, it's got different things that you can do. And it's got a chapter on divination too. And in answer to your question, that chapter answers the question, which is using divination systems is a way to activate and empower your intuition, because it requires your intuitive intelligence to make sense of what a divination system tells you. You have to be able to read between the lines. You can think of intuition as a form of pattern recognition. And it's a very subtle skill, because it's like you got to fill in the dots. There's a lot of missing dots. It's sort of like constellations in the sky. You know, who saw a lion in that bunch of stars? You know, you had to fill in a lot of dots to see that lion. So intuition is kind of like that. It's just a very subtle and fine form of pattern recognition that is very difficult to do when we're hamstrung by our desire to, to have everything make sense via the five senses and logic. So divination helps because it's a practice that demands the use of the intuition. So, I mean, even if you just did an I Ching reading every morning, you could just ask the question, you can use it as a meditation technique. You don't have to have a question or bring a question. In fact, I don't even recommend asking it a question, because most of the time people ask the wrong kind of question. You wouldn't ask a plumber to give you financial advice. It's like you don't ask the I Ching, where should I go to lunch today? Or what's the weather going to be like tomorrow? You ask it a question, you're asking it, you want a reflection on a dilemma or a problem or a situation, a relationship that you're having trouble sorting out. And so you just ask it to give you a reflection on that. So when I type in, like, we've created an app. And I'd say the best way to do the I Ching is to get my app. Now, I'm not trying to sell the app. It's a nonprofit thing, but it's on the iPhone, and basically you can go here and then you just type in whatever your question is, and not your question, your topic, your subject, and then that just helps you bear it in mind when you do the casting thing. And the way we do the casting thing is it's all timing. It's all timing. And so then you get a reading from it. And it's actually a much easier way to consult the I Ching. It's called the Visionary I Ching. It's on for Apple or Android. And it's a really good tool for people. Even if you want to use the coins, you can use the coins, and then you can look up that hexagram on the app to get my modern interpretation, which most people find a lot more usable than what you might get out of the Wilhelm Baines version. But we've kept it true to the spirit of the Wilhelm Baines version. So I don't know if I've answered your question or not.
Certainly, yeah. So I'm getting this sense that divination, is this process of gaining, I guess, closer and clearer access to that intuitive part of ourselves. and that there are these systems like the Ching. The system that I'm not as familiar with, I guess, is tarot cards, and I think a lot of people in our modern times will see something like these cards and they'll just immediately pass it off as a superstition, perhaps because they don't realize that it is a part of this kind of system of allowing us to gain a little bit deeper into. It's not about telling people what's going to happen, or like it's. But I guess I want to find out from you, because I've also fallen into that kind of skeptical path. But I think one thing that I'm finding in the way that you're describing these things is that you're interested in the ancient systems that have developed naturally through a culture that have been used as tools, not necessarily the modern new agey kind of.
Oh well, no, I'll explain the confusion to you
Yeah,
right
yeah,
now. And it's totally understandable that you
yeah,
and most people have that um, view of tarot cards in particular. Why? Because they've been appropriated by psychics and fortune tellers.
yeah.
And the same thing with the I Ching in China. There are people who are using it to tell the future. Well, these aren't fortune telling tools. Divination is not about fortune telling. It's not about predicting the future. It might give you an idea of which way the wind is blowing or what the probabilities might be going forward. But no, but these things have been appropriated by fortune tellers in order to enhance their credibility. Oh, I'm a tarot card reader. Well, if you go on to these psychic friends networks or these things, and I did this because I was in the business of authentic divination, do-it-yourself authentic divination. It was the way I thought of what I was doing. It had nothing to do with fortune telling. We weren't reading people's minds. It wasn't about mind reading. It wasn't psychic. But you go on these psychic friends networks, and the biggest category they have are tarot readers. Well, okay, I thought, okay, I'm going to try this. So I went there, and the woman that I got, I said, okay, well, what cards did I get? She goes, what do you mean, what cards? What, you're a tarot reader, right? I don't believe that you can pull cards for me, but you are. That's what you do. You pull cards for other people. That's another place where they lose me. Now, usually if you get a tarot reading with somebody in person, they actually have you pull the cards, and then they tell you what they mean. Problem is, they probably don't know what they mean. They're just going off the pictures on the cards. They don't have any understanding of the archetypes. They don't have any understanding. This is a set of archetypes that goes way back 1,000 years, and they don't know what the original archetype was. All they are doing is free association based on the art that some modern artist brought to it, who probably wasn't that well versed in the archetype set either. So they've been appropriated by fortune tellers because everybody wants to know the future. And so I completely avoid that. I don't believe that going to fortune tellers is a good idea unless you're just trying to have fun and you want to spend, $20 and see what somebody says. But so that's the reason that it has such a bad reputation. And this is part of what I was trying to straighten out. I mean, I didn't think I was going to succeed at it, but we basically didn't go that route. We never promised a prediction. There's three reasons that people use a divination system. Number one, they want insight. Number two, they want advice. And number three, they want to know what the future holds and how things are going to turn out. And that's by far the most popular thing. But that's also the weakest one of the three. If and that's what I would tell people to say, hey, if you get one new idea from an I Ching reading, hey, it's done its job. Yeah. Stop there. That's great. That's fantastic. You get one new idea. You get one insight. Maybe you get a little bit of advice based on timeless wisdom relative to some configuration of energy. That's fantastic. If you get some idea of which way the wind is blowing and what the future is going to produce, oh, well, that is like super lucky. But that's not something that you should count on.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. And I want to be respectful of your time. I just have one more question, because you're using this term archetypes. Obviously, this is something that Carl Jung has helped us to understand. But what are you meaning when you're talking about these archetypes, especially relating to the I Ching and other divination systems?
Well, I'm using the term in a Jungian sense. what is
These kind of primeval images and collective characteristics, those sorts of things. I'll let you explain it, but
That's right. That's right. Archetypes are configurations of energy or personality that that are related to the human condition. So you take the I Ching and it's got 64 archetypes. Okay, so you've got all these different situations like the darkening of the light or the approach of spring. Okay, what is the approach of spring? That's an archetype of fresh new energy. Or you've got creative power as the very first one. That's speaking to that whole essence of that outgoing, assertive power that we have in order to influence things. The second hexagram is called the receptive. I call it receptive power, which is like the allowing. That's the energy of allowing. So archetypes are just configurations of energy that we can tap into and we can channel. We don't need to use a divination system to benefit from archetypes. And I have a whole section in my book, Intuitive Intelligence, about how to invoke archetypes in daily life. Not necessarily, not through using a divination system, but just through being aware. Like, for instance, 4 foundational archetypes: the sovereign, the warrior, the magician, and the lover. Okay, so these are different parts of yourself, different parts of the psyche that you can call upon. The warrior is defending the boundaries. The sovereign is maintaining order in the realm. The magician is inventing things and coming up with things. And the lover is about merging and coming together. So we can call upon these things. Now, there are negative archetypes too, like the victim and the scapegoat, and there's all kinds of different aspects of the psyche that are that can be channeled in order to direct energy the way that you want or need to do it, or in order to let go of things. So it's I hope that helps a little bit about the meaning of archetypes.
It certainly does. Yeah, it certainly does. And I tell you what, I'm going to, after this interview, I'm going to go and get the I Ching out, and I'm going to see if I can figure this system out. But, Paula, thank you so much for spending the time. I'd love to do this again sometime, and I'd love to send you a copy of my book as well. But thank you so much for doing this. And where can people find you?
Well, I was just going to say, divination.com, www.divination.com. That's the website of my nonprofit. It tells you how to use the I Ching. There's a lot of information on there. And there's interviews, and there's a lot of the podcasts that I've produced, as well as blogs and things like that. It's a good resource. Also, there's a link to the Visionary I Ching app. So that's the best way to. And there's a way to contact me. There's a contact form on there. So
wonderful.
That's the best thing.
All right. Well, Paula, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Hey, thank you, Simon. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to the World Garden podcast. For more episodes just like these, or to join our community, go to theworldgarden.com. See you there.